Welcome to the Windy Valley Digest. I'm your host, Vince Cowley, and we're searching through the musty corners of bookshops, flea markets, libraries, and web archives to bring you stories that have been lost in time. This is episode 6, and today's reading is part 4 of Bernard Treves' Boots, a 17-part tale of intrigue and the Secret Service by Lawrence Clark. If you've missed the earlier installments, you can find them at our podcast page, as well as on YouTube at the Windy Valley Bookshelf and also on Rumble. Before we dive into today's episode, take a moment to explore the Windy Valley Bookshelf. Our YouTube channel brings classic literature to life with engaging audio dramas and beautifully illustrated readings. Journey alongside Mark Twain's mischievous Tom Sawyer, or step into a charming old-time Christmas with Washington Irving. You'll also find audio overviews of the Windy Valley Digest and this podcast, perfect if you're not already listening on YouTube. Visit windyvalleybookshelf.com or check the links on the Windy Valley Digest website. Subscribe today and let timeless tales sweep you away. And while you're discovering timeless stories on the Windy Valley Bookshelf, let us pause to hear a voice from a different past. A soldier writing from the front lines of the First World War. In each letter we glimpse the courage, the fear, and the quiet humanity of those who faced unimaginable hardships, reminding us that history is made not only in grand events, but in the thoughts and words of the people who lived through them. Tonight's letter comes from Robert Le Roux, a young French officer and son of well-known journalist and novelist Hugues Le Roux. Robert, who held a degree in sciences and had recently been engaged, was called to serve when war broke out in 1914. Writing from his hospital bed, he manages to convey his condition in only a few lines, offering us a stark and intimate glimpse into a soldier's experience.
I have been wounded in the arm, but that is nothing. Another bullet passed through the lungs. The spine is bad. This is tiresome, for my legs are paralyzed, but they tell me that as the wound is a clean one, I shall recover. That is all. I am able to write you owing to the kindness of Monsieur N., one of the officials of the hospital.
Before we close this segment, we still have one more voice to hear. It comes not from Robert himself, but from Louis P., the hospital official who helped write Robert's note. In his follow-up letter to Hugues Le Roux, Louis speaks with honesty and compassion about the gravity of the young officer's condition. Sir, just now I wrote to you by your son's bedside, almost under his dictation, a letter which could leave you with a certain amount of hope. To be sincere, I must deny what I have said. I would not do so, as I do not wish to be the first to bring you such bad news, but it would not be loyal on my part to leave you under the impression of a message which you had the right to suppose sincere. Your son bears with great courage such a wound as his is. His only thought is for his family. Please, sir, let me send you my affectionate sympathy for your grief as a father at such a time, and, may I add, my cordial admiration of your son. Louis P. This second letter strips away the fragile hope Robert tried to preserve for his father, revealing instead the full weight of his injuries. Robert Le Roux would die from his wounds at just 27 years old. His quiet courage and the grief carried by his family stand as a reminder of the many personal stories behind the vast tragedy of the First World War. As we step back from the harrowing realities of war, from letters written under the shadow of mortal danger, we return to another story of courage, identity, and peril, though of a very different kind. In our ongoing saga of espionage and mistaken identity, John Manton's journey continues, teetering between suspicion and revelation. In our previous episode, John Manton's masquerade as Bernard Treves had brought him to the brink of ruin. Arrested and confronted with damning evidence, he declared his true identity, but few believed him. Only Captain Gilbert seemed willing to vouch for his honesty, leaving John's fate hanging by a thread. Now, as the inquiry deepens, the tide begins to turn. General Whiston and the great spymaster Dacent Smith put John to the test, subjecting him to a piercing interrogation. To their astonishment, his knowledge and character hold firm. The truth of his identity emerges at last. John Manton is no traitor, but a man caught in another's tangled life. Instead of punishment, he is offered something unexpected, a chance to fight for Britain, not in uniform, but in the hidden war, one fought in the shadows, where the dangers are greater than any he faced as a soldier. But even as John takes his first steps into this new and perilous world, the enemy is moving. Manners and Baron Rothenau, German agents disguised as English gentlemen, are already seeking out Bernard Treves. Their search leads them to a mysterious young woman, one who claims Treves is her husband. And it is in this very house, with Manners and Rothenau lurking inside, that John now walks, welcomed as Bernard Treves himself. The stage is set for a deadly game of deception, and John Manton finds himself its unwilling centerpiece.
Things were not as they seemed. The situation in the little parlour was delicate in the extreme, and as John's gaze passed from the fat countenance of Manners to the cold forcefulness of Cheriton, whose strong hand but a moment ago gripped his own in greeting, he told himself that if he could creep from that situation with credit, he could escape from anything. Both Cheriton's and Manners' welcome rang false. They were not pleased to see him. They were startled and puzzled, and Cheriton, at least, was more than puzzled. John knew that whatever occurred between himself and these two men must occur privately. Moreover, there was a second danger, which he knew to be ever present. The light in the bright little parlour was quite strong. The fact that he had dexterously placed his back to the window might not serve him for more than a few minutes. What if Elaine Treves suddenly discovered her mistake? Somehow the teeming possibilities of the moment gave steadiness to John's nerves. He thought of a plan, and put it into execution on the instant. "Elaine," he said. He used her name for the first time, and as he spoke he took her slender hand in his grasp. "I have business to discuss with Captain Cheriton and Mr. Manners." "I promise that we shall not keep your husband more than a few minutes," intervened Cheriton. Yes, old Manwitz for once is right, he thought. Here is an Englishwoman possessed of beauty. He made across the room, intending politely to hold open the door for Elaine to pass out. John, however, was quicker, and as he held the door wide, Elaine lifted her grey-blue, beautiful eyes and searched his. Her expression, John thought, was one of surprise. Surprise at what? He closed the door, and instantly Cheriton laid a hand on his shoulder. "Well," he demanded, "what happened to you last night?" "You were present at the beginning of the happening," returned John. "The four men were police officers, were they not?" "Detectives from Scotland Yard. They took me there, cross-examined me, and discovered that a mistake had been made." Manners drew a deep breath of relief. "Ah, a mistake!" he exclaimed. Cheriton, who was busy with a cigarette, looked at John under his brows. He had retreated to the hearth, and was leaning with his back against the mantelshelf. "A very unpleasant incident for you, eh, Treves?" he inquired. "Very," responded John. "And my overcoat, my very excellent summer overcoat, what happened to that?" From the moment of John's appearance in the room he had been leading up to this question. Had his overcoat been searched? Had Treves' incriminating letter been discovered? It occurred to him that if John, immediately after his arrest, had established his identity, no search of his overcoat was probable. And yet caution was bred in him. His deeply subtle mind prompted him to probe the matter to its depths, and at the same time to convey no suspicion of his anxiety to John. "Cherriton, your overcoat is quite safe," John said quietly. "I left it on your behalf in the cloak room at Charing Cross Station." He put his hand into his pocket and drew out the ticket. Cherriton took it from his extended fingers. "I am particularly obliged to you, Treves," he said. "I have a special fondness for that overcoat. So the Scotland Yard people were for once mistaken?" "Entirely," said John with truth. "They mistook me for another man." "Were you made acquainted with the charges against the real person?" probed Cherriton. "He was wanted for misappropriation of military funds." Both Manners and Cherriton exhibited increasing interest in the unknown culprit. "You heard the person's name?" "His name was John Manton. He was a sergeant at Scarthoe Fort." "That is in the Isle of Wight?" "Yes," John answered. "That accounts for them seizing me. They traced me from the Isle of Wight." Cherriton and Manners exchanged glances. Neither man felt at all comfortable, but Cherriton felt that he had pressed the matter enough. He suddenly assumed his air of bland amiability, but it sat ill on him. "Well, Manners," he exclaimed, looking at his confrère, "you were mistaken. You assumed that our dear friend Treves had escaped, and were in a great fluster of anxiety on his behalf, whereas the little misfortune that occurred to him was all a mistake." "All a mistake," repeated John. "And now I think," Cherriton remarked, taking up his grey felt hat and denting it carefully with his hand, "I think we will not keep you from your wife any longer." For the second time that day he gripped John's hand in his, and John, looking back into his cold blue eyes, felt the steady, penetrating power of Cherriton's gaze. Here was a man, thought John, used to command; a man possessed of exceptional powers of mind and physique. "You are a daring fellow," thought John, "a subtle and cunning worker of evil, but for once in your life you are mistaken. I am not the man you think, either in name or in character." Then a singular thing happened to John. On the very instant when his fingers slid away from the other's touch, a flaming instinct ran through him, a passionate impulse to leap upon the other's throat and squeeze the life out of him came upon him as a definite and conscious wish. Though he had known Cherriton only for 2 days, he felt a great hate swirl up in him against this serenely poised, potent enemy. Against Manners, whom he knew, and whom Dacent Smith knew to be a spy, he felt nothing of this. That afternoon he had been instructed well and thoroughly by Dacent Smith. Dacent Smith had talked much with him, drawing him out, subtly examining him as to his aspirations and his powers; and gradually, during the talk of that afternoon, Smith had come to realise that in John Manton he possessed a keen and highly wrought weapon. Here was a young man who had fought for his country, who was willing to fight for it again in any circumstances. And long before the end of that interview the chief of a great branch of the Secret Service had laid his hand on John's arm. "Manton," he had explained, "you were wasted as a sergeant at Scarthoe Head. There are big things awaiting you. You have fought the enemy in the open; from to day you shall fight him in the dark. You will find him more tricky and subtle and dangerous than he was in France." Then he had paused a moment, looking at John. "Accidents sometimes happen, Manton, my boy." "One must be prepared for accidents," John had answered quietly. "I have lost 2 or 3 splendid fellows during the past year. I am telling you this," the chief resumed, "that you may remain always on your guard. Fate or Providence has placed you in a wonderful position with the aid of your acquaintance Manwitz. I have the complete dossier in that cupboard over there." He pointed to a cabinet against the wall. "Your acquaintance with Manwitz gives you a splendid start. You will use it to acquire such information as will be useful to the department, but in the first place you must discover all there is to know about the amiable and unexpected Cherriton. We shall at the same time be working to discover things from our end." John thought of this conversation as Manners and Cherriton took their departure. "You will come and see me again soon, will you not?" Manners had remarked at the moment of departure. He looked cunningly and meaningly into John's eyes. In effect he had been saying, "You will come and see me again immediately those cocaine tabloids have been consumed." Bernard Treves's craving for cocaine, both Manners and Cherriton knew, held that young man as by bonds of steel. "I'll come again soon," John had answered, slipping the new address Manners had given him into his waistcoat pocket. He watched the two men pass into the street, then closed the door and re entered the empty parlour. The daintiness, the cleanliness, and the perfect taste of the little apartment had already won his appreciation. He wondered when Elaine Treves would descend from above, and what would happen then. Until now only a few fleeting words had passed between himself and the beautiful girl who was Treves's wife. What was to happen now in the intimacy that would ensue when she re entered the room? John was smoking one of Treves's cigarettes, with his back against the mantelshelf, when the door opened and Elaine quietly entered. "So you have got rid of them, Bernard?" She looked at him, he thought, a little shyly, with something of reserve in her glance. He watched her as she crossed to a chintz-covered wicker arm-chair with its back to the window. At her side was a small work-table. She took out a needle, a thread, and various bits of coloured silk. A silence drew itself out that became awkward. John moved from one foot to another. Then he made an effort to pick up the thread of what he believed to be Treves's life in relation to the girl who was so industriously sewing with bowed head. "I am sorry I wasn't able to come in answer to your wire." "I think, Bernard, you might have answered it," returned Elaine, quietly, without raising her head. "Well, you know, I was not able to. Circumstances did not permit me to answer it." "I was afraid of that." She suddenly looked up at him with an expression of hopelessness in her fine eyes. "Bernard," she said, "sometimes I think you will never, never be able to keep your promise to me." "Why not?" John asked, feeling his way cautiously. He could see that she was stirred, that something had moved her deeply. He was more than ever assured of this when she rose, stood before him, and looked steadily into his face. "Oh, Bernard, if you could only fight!" Under the close scrutiny of her eyes, John felt extraordinarily uncomfortable. "Other people have fought and have conquered," went on the girl. "Why should not you? Sometimes," she went on, "you are quite as you should be, just as you are now, the man who once won my love. And then again——" She broke off. Accidentally John had put his fingers in his waistcoat pocket. He felt the contact of the little bottle of cocaine tabloids Manners had forced upon him. He had guessed that Elaine was referring to Treves's enslavement to this drug, and he drew out the bottle, holding it in the palm of his hand. He saw the girl look at the tabloids with an expression of loathing. Then something seemed to pass through her that drew her rigid and erect. "I wonder," she said, "in our very short months together, how often you have promised, have sworn to give it up." Her manner suddenly changed again, and she held out her hand imploringly. "I wonder, Bernard, if you have the courage to give them to me." "Certainly," John said, "I will give them to you." He unscrewed the top of the little bottle and poured the white tabloids one after another into the palm of her hand. She looked at them for a moment, then into his face. John was still standing with his back towards the small fire. He held the girl's hand on his arm. She was thrusting him aside. A moment later she had flung the tabloids into the red embers, and before John knew it she was holding his hand in hers, looking up into his face. "Bernard," she said, in a low voice, "I believe you have changed. I think strength is coming to you. You will win yet." "Yes," John answered, "I swear I'll win." The words came from him almost without volition, and at the same moment an instinct came to him that matters were drifting too far. He turned the conversation with a laugh, and for some minutes they were discussing general topics. He helped her to prepare the supper, going into the little kitchen and bringing out plates and dishes under her direction. Daylight faded, much to John's relief. They took supper together in the little parlour. John noticed how deft and womanly she was. "Our friend Treves is a lucky man, if he only knew it," thought he. "I am afraid there is nothing to drink, Bernard." "Oh, that doesn't trouble me," John answered, then saw her pause with the teapot uplifted in frank surprise. "I mean," said John, striving to recover the situation, "if you haven't got it, I don't mind." The meal passed off in an air of general cheerfulness. Elaine's little clock struck 9, and when the meal was at an end, John took the seat opposite Elaine and her little work basket. She busied herself with her fancy work, and occasionally John caught her eyes resting upon him with a thoughtful and somewhat puzzled expression. He strove to gather from her manner what her feelings really were towards her husband. "She can't love him," thought John. "He's too much of a brute and a waster for that. And yet women are strange creatures." Elaine had been silent for some minutes, but presently she spoke, uttering something that appeared to have dwelt for long in her mind. "Bernard," she said, "I am not so hard as you think, but I am sure the way I am acting is the only right way." She paused. "I am sure it is the right way," answered John, looking into her candid, girlish face. He noticed again the flicker of surprise. He was always making false steps. The situation was difficult beyond everything he had experienced. Dacent Smith had impressed upon him the importance of tact and finesse. Here was a situation thrust upon him requiring abundance of both. "You seem to have changed your point of view." "Well," John began cautiously. "You were so violent with me," interposed Elaine. "There was no intention on my part to be anything of the sort towards you," John answered. He wondered what Treves had done, what Treves had said. He began to experience pleasure in the situation. He began to wonder what was to happen next. But very soon after that the clock struck 10. Elaine put away her needlework and rose somewhat abruptly. "You must go now, Bernard." John looked at her for a moment in surprise. "Oh, yes," he said, "I see. Of course." Then Elaine crossed the hearthrug and laid her slender hands on the lapels of his coat. "To night, Bernard," she said, "I have almost felt as if you were your old self again." "Thanks," answered John awkwardly. His position at that moment was awkward and utterly false. He was like a man who walks blindly on the edge of a precipice. He wondered if she was about to kiss him, or if she expected him to salute her in that way. This doubt was still upon him when Elaine reached up and touched his cheeks lightly with her lips. There was no passion, no love, nothing but a sort of sisterly affection in the embrace, but John was glad when it was over. If she had been a less beautiful woman, the situation would have been so very much easier. Elaine accompanied him along the passage, handing him his hat and stick as they went. In the darkness at the door, as they shook hands, John felt that the impression of her fingers was warmer and infinitely more cordial than the greeting she had given him upon his arrival. He could see her face only dimly. She had seemed surprised that he had departed so easily. He felt that he must say something, utter some remark that possibly might have been uttered by Bernard Treves. "I am sorry to have to go," he said. Then Elaine's voice came to him quietly in the darkness. There was a new note in her words. "You must come again—soon, Bernard." The door closed softly, and she was gone.
She's just a girl trying to survive. He's the cop who wants to help, but can't, yet. Rosalind's senior year isn't about prom or grades. It's about hiding bruises, secrets, and the fear that she'll never escape. Officer Mark Tucker has his own battles. PTSD, a broken home life, and a town where people keep disappearing. When they come together, survival becomes a question of trust, strength, and whether either of them can ask for help before it's too late. Raw, haunting, and deeply human, Scars is a story of trauma, resilience, and the fragile hope of healing. If you love gritty crime thrillers and psychological suspense that lingers long after the last page, this book is for you. Scars, available on Amazon starting September 15th.
Dacent Smith, busy in his luxurious bachelor apartments in Jermyn Street, was going through a pile of documents, all relating directly or indirectly to the multitudinous activities of his department. He had continued his work for perhaps half an hour after his brief luncheon interval when the manservant entered and announced a visitor. Dacent Smith's manservant was discretion itself. He looked like a walking secret, and was a big, pallid man, with high cheek-bones and a grim, hard mouth. He was devoted body and soul to Dacent Smith, and no tortures ever devised could have ever wormed a word from him of his master's activities. "Well, Grew?" "Mr. Treves, sir." "I'll see Mr. Treves at once." Grew, the manservant, departed, and a minute later John was ushered into the apartment. Dacent Smith greeted him with brief cordiality, then indicated a chair. "Well, Treves," he said with a smile, "what is your news?" "There is very little to tell you, sir, so far. The person who wrote that telegram signed Elaine is Bernard Treves's wife." Dacent Smith lifted his eyebrows. A twinkle of humour was detectable in his expression. "What happened?" "She was quite deceived, sir." "A piquant situation," smiled Dacent Smith. "Very," answered John seriously. "You see how quickly you find yourself in deep waters, my friend." Dacent Smith was looking at him with an expression of raillery in his keen eyes. Nevertheless, he was saying inwardly, "I like you, Manton. You are a man after my own heart. There is a good deal of humour, as well as courage and intelligence, hidden behind that good-looking face of yours." "Now, Manton," he said, "tell me about Manwitz. Are you in touch with him again?" "I have his address, sir, and an invitation to go to him whenever I wish—that is, whenever the cocaine habit seizes me violently." "I see," remarked the elder man. "Whenever the craving is violently upon you, you go to Manwitz and he supplies your want?" John nodded. "It is amazing," went on the chief, "the way these fellows manage to secure these drugs. Perhaps later, Manton, you will be able to enlighten us upon that little matter, but in the meantime Cherriton is your chief responsibility." "Cherriton showed a particular anxiety about his overcoat, sir, containing Treves's letter." John gave a brief report of the events of the previous evening, and Dacent Smith made one or two notes on a slip of paper marked M15. When John had finished, the elder man leaned back in his chair. "It will take you some days, perhaps weeks," he said, "to get the hang of things with us. At present you are to play a lone hand. There is a chain of German emissaries working against us, some traitors and some spies, who pass information from all our dockyards to London and thence to Germany. I want you to get into contact with one of the links of this chain. Any link will serve our purpose. You must do all you can to keep the confidence of Cherriton and Manwitz. If they set you upon any task, carry it through absolutely. If papers or documents are given to you to be delivered elsewhere, don't fail to act absolutely according to their instructions. If you can get a sight of the documents and memorize them during transit, do so, of course. This applies to letters or documents which may be handed to you by strangers, other German spies. Do you understand the importance of all this?" John assured him that he did. "It appears to me, sir," he added, "that by doing this I shall myself become a sort of link in their chain." The great man looked at him with eyes of approbation. "Exactly," he responded. "That is what you will be. Information is leaking out of England day by day, hour by hour, rippling along these chains of which I speak." Half an hour later John took his departure from the chief's sumptuous bachelor apartments. He had learned many things that amazed him, and one of these things, which filled him with fury and loathing, was that there were indeed traitors in unexpected places, that there were British-born people, few but active, who were willing to sell their country into the power of the enemy. "I hope it won't be my destiny to run across one of these gentry," thought John, "for even the chief himself would find it hard to make me keep my hands off him." And yet that night, in a few brief hours, he was to find himself in contact with just such a traitor. Reaching the corner of Jermyn Street, after his departure from Dacent Smith's rooms, John hailed a taxi and drove to Hampstead Tube in Tottenham Court Road. Here he took train to Hampstead, and made his way towards the address Manwitz had given him. The address was Sheraton's, and when John arrived there he found that the unamiable captain occupied a suite of rooms in a large, old-fashioned house near the Heath. The house was maintained by a retired butler, who received John at the door. The butler ascended to a handsomely furnished, spacious drawing-room on the first floor. Here Manners was seated at a grand piano, and Cherriton, deep in an arm-chair, was reading an English pacifist pamphlet. "Is that a telegram?" asked Cherriton as the door opened. "No, sir," answered the man. "It is a Mr. Bernard Treves called in to see Mr. Manners." 2 minutes later John stepped into the room. "Did you get your overcoat?" he asked, shaking hands with Cherriton. The fair man nodded. "Many thanks," he said. He had spent the earlier part of that day inquiring into the existence, status, and habits of John Manton. He was still not quite satisfied as to his visitor's release from Scotland Yard, and at that very moment he was awaiting a telegram from the Isle of Wight which would either increase his suspicions or remove them altogether. In the meantime he preferred to trust John to a certain extent. "You have come at an opportune time, Treves," he said. John was seated now, and this time accepted a cigarette from the Baron's case. Suddenly Rathenau looked him full in the face. "You and I, Treves," he said, "have both been treated damnably." "Damnably," answered John, wondering what was coming. The other continued: "But there comes a time, Treves, when the worm turns. You turned and I turned. You cast in your lot with our friend Manners, who knows how to appreciate loyalty. Manners," he continued in the ironical tone that was his general habit, "fat and stupid and lazy as he is always willing to pay for loyalty." John looked into the Baron's thick-skinned, pallid face, into the steel-like eyes, and smiled inwardly. A pause came. John leaned forward. "Cherriton," he said, "what are you leading up to?" Manners, from the piano-stool, spoke up. "Ah, you see, Cherriton, he is sharp, our friend Treves. Tell him what you want, Cherriton, straight out." He rose, came, for all his great bulk, softly across the room. He laid a fat hand on John's shoulder and looked down at him. "Bernard," he half whispered, "you shall have all you want of everything. Money, and the other thing. I want you to throw in your lot with me, as the good captain has done. That note," he continued, still in the half whisper, "you gave me in regard to the sailing of the Polidor was well appreciated in certain circles." "I'm glad to hear that," John answered. "That was good service," continued Manners, but there are bigger things afoot." He paused a moment, then walked round John and seated himself on a sofa quite near. "You have heard, no doubt," he continued, "of the Imperator. You mean the new Grey Star liner?" Manners nodded. "A monster ship, a wonder ship. 48,000 tons." He uttered the words slowly, rolling them unctuously over his tongue. "Nearly as big as the Vaterland," John said, and for the life of him he could not help looking across at Cherriton's face. But Cherriton was quick as lightning. "The Vaterland?" he repeated. "You mean the German ship?" John returned his attention to Manners. He could feel the web closing about him, the web in which Dacent Smith had ordered him to entangle himself. "The Imperator," said Manners, "is to sail one day quite soon, but your Admiralty has grown doubly cunning of late. As yet we know not either her port of departure or the hour of departure." John noticed that the fat man's tones deepened as he spoke. Excitement gleamed in his eyes. He leaned forward and laid a fat hand on Bernard's knee. "Treves, my boy, I trust you, eh?" "Certainly," answered John truthfully. "I want you to trust me." "Good!" exclaimed Manners, uttering the word thickly in his throat. "Now you will understand Cherriton and I cannot appear in certain places, but with you it is different with you, eh?" "Quite," said John. "I can appear anywhere without suspicion." Cherriton, who had remained silent, again took control of the situation. "What Manners and I want you to do," he said, "is to stay a few days at the Savoy Hotel. A Dutch gentleman is giving up room 104C. You are to take that room, and stay at the hotel at Manners' expense." "Thank you," said John. "There will be no need for you to stint yourself. What is more, you will have no duties whatever to perform." John lifted his eyebrows in genuine surprise. "I don't quite see what help I can be in that case." "We are hoping that the matter will resolve itself," said Cherriton. "Yes, yes," intervened Manners. "Everything will resolve itself beautifully. All you have to do now, my dear boy, is to say that you will accept the—" "The invitation," intercepted Cherriton. John thought there was nothing easier in the world than to accept an invitation to stay, free of expense, at a first class hotel and with no duties to perform. He said as much to Manners, and 2 nights later found him the occupant of the room 104C, a delightful Louis XVI bedroom overlooking the Embankment. He had spent a day and a night at the hotel, and no incident whatever had occurred. On the evening of the second night, however, after dinner, John seated himself in the foyer and ordered coffee and cigarettes. Presently, in the great crowd moving, laughing and talking near him, John observed a politician who at various periods in the past had loomed importantly in the public eye. "He is even more ugly than his photographs," thought John, watching the important personage move among his friends. John did not like Beecher Monmouth's smile. Altogether he disliked the man on the instant, and was the more astonished to notice that a strikingly beautiful woman of 30, wearing a glittering diamond necklace and diamond earrings, moved towards him and slipped her arm through his. The woman wore a deeply décolleté evening dress of a shimmering silk that looked to John now green and now blue. He noticed her flash a smile into Beecher Monmouth's face. He saw the politician put her hand into his. Then recollection came to John. The woman was Beecher Monmouth's wife, a beautiful woman 30 years his junior, who had appeared from nowhere and married him. "She certainly is a beautiful woman," thought John. "A case of Beauty and the Beast." Then, to his utter amazement, Mrs. Beecher Monmouth's eyes met his. She slid her arm from her husband's and made her way quickly through the crowd to John. He felt his heart beat quicken. A moment later Mrs. Beecher Monmouth was holding out her hand towards him. She flashed a smile into his face. "My dear Mr. Treves," she said, in a voice that was low and intimate, "I have been looking for you all the evening." A moment later she was shaking hands with John. "I must fly now," she added, "but you must come and see me to morrow, 6 o'clock." A moment later she was hurrying back towards her husband, her gown shimmering and gleaming as she went. There was something in the palm of John's hand, something that had passed from Mrs. Beecher Monmouth to himself. Holding his hand below the table and free from observation, John saw that the something Mrs. Beecher Monmouth had passed into his hand was a slip of paper on which was pencilled "Imperator, 3 o'clock to morrow, Route 28." John was conscious of a quite definite thrill. His nerve was of the best; he had accepted the momentous slip of paper without any outward sign of disturbance. Indeed, he had smiled back into Mrs. Beecher Monmouth's eyes in a manner that had won that lady's sincerest approbation. Nevertheless, he was not inwardly calm. He felt that fate or destiny had seized him suddenly in its relentless grip. The slip of paper was still in his hand, concealed beneath the level of the table. For some minutes he drew at his cigarette, then, carefully taking out the pocket book, laid the slip in its leaves and replaced the book in the inner breast pocket of his coat. For some minutes longer he retained his seat, leaning back in the delicate gilt chair. His gaze wandered among the brilliant and fashionable crowd moving about him. The gentle murmur of music mingled still with the chatter of voices, and 20 feet away he caught the gleam of Mrs. Beecher Monmouth's ear rings, the scintillation of her superb diamond necklace. She was talking to her yellow-skinned and unprepossessing husband, but her attention was entirely and solely fixed upon John. Their eyes met, and John was obliged to concede, for the second time, that she was a woman of exceptional beauty. The art of her coiffure, and possibly the art of her complexion expert, had wrought its best for her. Nevertheless, she would have stood out among any assemblage of young and prepossessing women. Her husband quite visibly adored her, and every word she condescended to transmit to him was received with a quick, responsive smile on his part. John was thinking rapidly, wondering and speculating. Was it possible that Beecher Monmouth knew of the existence of the little slip of paper that reposed in his pocket book? Beecher Monmouth, who had sat on numerous committees, who had more than once stood in the running for an under secretaryship. The thing seemed utterly incredible. As these things flashed through John's mind, realization slowly came to him that Mrs. Beecher Monmouth was observing him with close intensity under slightly lowered lids. John rose, and as he did so the lady flashed a brilliant smile towards him, an intimate, understanding smile, full of meaning. "I wish I knew what you meant," thought John, as he made his way through the throng out towards the cloak-room. The circulating door received him, and he passed out into the dim light of the Strand. There was a crowd, as always at that hour, and a young man who followed closely at his heels found difficulty in keeping him in sight. John was burning once more to look at the information Mrs. Beecher Monmouth had conveyed to him, but caution forbade anything of the sort. He was determined that this, his first swim in deep waters, should achieve a successful issue. His chief desire in life was to make good in Dacent Smith's eyes, and, moreover, obeying his chief's instructions, he had already indelibly impressed upon his memory the portentous sentence, "Imperator, 3 o'clock to morrow, Route 28." The word treachery floated into his mind and filled him with rage. Until now he had been outside, one of the public, but to night the curtain had been drawn aside. He felt himself engaged in the secret fight which is for ever taking place beneath the surface, the fight between our own secret service and the spies and traitors in the pay of the other nations. At Hampstead, John emerged from the tube and made his way through the darkness of Well Walk. Presently he turned to the left, through an alley, crossed a square of shabby-looking houses, and ascended a further closely built, narrow street leading towards Cherriton's residence. The young man who had followed him from the Savoy was still in his wake. At this point, however, he apparently ceased his pursuit and vanished up a side alley. John, who had been aware of footsteps for some minutes, halted and looked behind him. The road was empty, and the suspicion that had been growing on him vanished. Nevertheless, he laid a hand on his hip pocket, assured himself that he was prepared for eventualities, and moved forward again. "I'll give this nefarious bit of news to Cherriton, and then hop down to Dacent Smith and report the fact as quickly as I can," thought John. He reached the top of Christchurch Road and paused to recollect which turning was the right one. At that moment some one moved in the shadow of the church railings near him, and before John could turn his head, a doubled fist smote him heavily. The attack was so sudden, unexpected, and swift that before he could in any way retaliate, a second blow had been delivered. His assailant leaped through the air, clasped two strong hands round his neck, and fell into the road, still gripping for all he was worth. The two struggled ignominiously, and John became aware that the stranger, who had released one hand grip, was groping for the precious pocket book. For the first time John was able to aim a blow, then with a violent twist he drew himself uppermost, and plunged his knee heavily into the other's chest. In the dim light he observed that his opponent was young. John was already aware that he had met no mean antagonist, and he was taking no chances. The downward blow he now delivered on the other man's countenance staggered him for a moment. He wrenched himself free and stood upright on his feet. His enemy was prone, but only for a moment. "You've got a good deal of spirit, my young friend," said John through his teeth, "but you'll get nothing from me, except another punch like the last. Now, get up." "Thanks," returned the other. He rose and began to dust his clothes carefully. John did not like the man's attitude. He was quite obviously preparing to make another attack. "Now," commanded John, moving back a pace, "don't try that with me." He stepped back and reached for the Colt weapon that reposed in his pocket. "I should hate to do anything drastic," he continued, "but if you make it a habit to leap at people in the dark, and to aim half-armed jolts at strangers, you must take the consequences." "I am prepared to take anything that is coming to me," responded the young man. He spoke almost jauntily, and John admired his spirit. "I evidently did not hit you quite as hard as I thought," John remarked. "Quite hard enough," responded the other, "but please don't shoot, because——" Then, to John's amazement, and with the utmost daring, he leapt forwards like a flash and seized John's pistol. There was a swift, fierce struggle. The moment was one for quick decisions. The stranger held the weapon by the wrong end, and John knew it. Unexpectedly he let go, and simultaneously landed a heavy left on the young man's down-bent jaw. He followed with a right, and then another left. He was as busy as he had ever been, and he knew he was fighting for his entire future, possibly for his life. "I've had enough," gasped the stranger. He reeled away and seated himself on the farther side of the narrow street. John searched about, picked up the weapon from the middle of the road, and pocketed it. Then he buttoned his coat, after carefully satisfying himself that the pocket book was still in its place, and prepared to go. "Good night," called the other, seated on the edge of the pavement, as he went. Manton, however, was in no mood for persiflage. He took himself off, walking as swiftly as he could. "He certainly doesn't lack pluck," mused John. 5 minutes later he reached the large house wherein Cheriton had his abode. "I want to see Captain Cheriton at once," he said, when the door was opened to him. He found Cheriton alone in the big drawing room. He was in evening clothes, and was wearing comfortable house slippers. "So it's you, Treves!" exclaimed the German as the door closed. "Come in, and I'll give you a drink of whisky. That is always acceptable, eh?" "Always," answered John. Cheriton was looking at him intently. "There is a slight cut on your forehead." "Is there? It must be a scratch." John applied his handkerchief to the slight abrasion, then slipped off his overcoat and took a drink of whisky and soda. "I have some news for you, Cheriton." "News?" The other flashed a swift glance at him. John slowly drew out the pocket-book and produced the slip of paper. "You wanted to know when the Imperator sailed out, and by what route." Cheriton was suddenly and unfeignedly impatient. "What is it you know?" he demanded. "At the Savoy to-night," John said quietly, "this was handed to me." He passed the slip of paper into the German's eager fingers. "Gott!" exclaimed Cheriton, utterly absorbed. "You got this from——" "Mrs. Beecher Monmouth." 3 o'clock to–morrow," mused Cheriton. "There is not much time for us to act." He looked suddenly into John's face. "What a woman she is!" he exclaimed. "Invaluable! Invaluable!" "Invaluable!" echoed John. Cheriton laid a hand on John's arm. "Keep your hold on her, my dear Treves. Your work to–night has been excellent." Excitement had brought an unusual gleam into his hard eyes. "We will do great things for you yet." He crossed the room and rang the bell imperiously. "My coat and hat," he commanded of the butler when the man appeared. "When Mr. Manners returns, ask him to wait up for me."
As this episode closes, we remember courage in all its forms. Robert Le Roux, gravely wounded, yet unbroken, faced his trials with quiet heroism, writing to his father with strength and dignity despite mortal injuries. At the same time, our fictional John Manton navigates the world of mistaken identities and spies, proving his resourcefulness and steadfast character under pressure. Both accounts, fact and fiction, remind us that courage manifests itself in many ways. On the battlefield, in hospital wards, with families left behind enduring fear and uncertainty, or in the secret struggles of the unseen world. Our thanks go to David Wales, whose voice brought Robert's letter and Bernard Treves' boots to life. And don't forget to visit the Windy Valley Digest for more stories that have been lost in time. Our closing quote for this episode comes from Douglas MacArthur. "The soldier, above all others, prays for peace, for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war." This is Vince Cowley for the Windy Valley Digest reminding you, keep exploring, keep reading, and let the stories of courage, both real and imagined, inspire your own.